Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Although the topic is on education, uh, because it's Montek and because we are now in the 30th year of economic reforms, so instead of economy and reforms, I would rather talk about the economics of reform. Can't let this opportunity go. His recent book, Backstage, is one of the finest books that I've read on this subject. It's partly autobiographical, partly documentative. I strongly advise everybody to read it. Uh, there's a particular page there where he talks about how he blended into the civil services or the politics dominated, and how he managed to be what he is by the skills that you require. And I think that would be very educative for all of you. Montek, I'm going to begin straight in the deep end. 30 years of economic reforms, in my opinion, the Congress party's greatest contribution to this country in terms of the economy. They undid everything that had happened in the past 44 years with this one statement on industrial policy 1991 and the union budget 91-92. And yet, when 24th July 2021 happened, I didn't see any celebrations from Congress party. I didn't see anybody take ownership for the India that we see today, the hopes that we have today. They all have their roots in this statement of industrial policy 1991. So what's happening here? Why is the Congress party going away from taking credit for this fantastic policy?
Well, Gautam, well, first of all, thank you and thank the organizers for inviting me here. And I'm looking forward to this exchange. You know, the question you've asked really is about the Congress party. And I have no privileged access to the mind of the party. I'm not a member. So I don't know why they do what they do.
You have 3 decades of policy experience working with them so closely. I'm sure you must have spoken with every minister, every leader who came, the states. So it's just a perception.
No,
We're not saying
I see. I think part of the problem is that, very few parties make a big thing about the reforms. You have to, essentially, the credit you have to give to the Congress party in the 90s is that they allowed the reforms to happen, okay? And of course, where the reforms succeed, you take credit for the success. They took credit that, look, we've got you out of the crisis. When growth was high, they took credit for that. But I agree with you that they did not, I don't think they were comfortable with the fact that the essence of reforms was to undo what we had been talking about for 30 years. Now, the fellows who did the reforms were aware of this. And I mean, Jairam Ramesh in his book points out that when the industrial policy went to the cabinet, I mean, the industrial policy actually, a fairer description of the industrial policy would have been to say, look, fellow citizens, we've been doing things in the last 30 years which didn't make much sense. The world has changed and we're now going to do it differently. But of course, nobody ever does that. So the approach was, even in the past, we have made changes. There was this industrial policy, then that industrial, and now you have another industrial policy. But actually, the earlier ones were just a rehash of whatever existed before. This one turned it on its head. So maybe it is their judgment that, they prefer continuity with change.
Yeah, so the earlier policies, I think the edifice was set in the resolution 1948 and the industrial policy 1956.
Yes.
Everything else has been a mirror or an incrementalism on and off around it. So if they said that we are celebrating this, are they saying that Nehru was wrong? Are they saying that Indira Gandhi was wrong?
See, I think it's always very difficult for a party which is itself changing what it was doing in the past. I mean, if the Congress party had been doing something and there was a crisis and somebody voted somebody else in, that party could have said, this is all nonsense, we're going to do something differently. When it's the same party, well, they don't try to emphasize the difference, but give them credit for making the change. China was very similar. I mean, Deng Xiaoping turned Mao Zedong's policies on its head, but he never criticized Mao Zedong. So I think in these big societies, there's somehow very often felt that evolutionary change is better. You know, Arif Muhammad Khan, governor, this morning, sort of emphasized that revolution is not our thing, and more continuous evolution. And in a way, what happened at the time of the economic reforms reflects that. There's much more continuity, although every now and then governments try to say that we're doing things differently. They're not really doing that many different, they may be doing things better, trying to do things better, but there's less. And I think since, if you look at the whole continuity, 1991 was different, because for the first time we said, look, A, B, C, D was just wrong and we're changing it. And I think we need to do many more things in future.
So I look at the statement on industrial policy 1991 as changing the moral structure in the way that business was viewed. I think it opened business, it allowed foreign investment, it allowed privatization, and gradually brought some dignity to the business of doing business in the country. Subsequent reforms over 3 decades across various prime ministers, I've seen the conviction grow. So we've seen the entry of several regulators, SEBI, PFRDA. We've seen privatizations. We've seen restrictive laws such as FERA become FEMA, and now FEMA may become something even more easy. So across 30 years, what I have as an observer is seen that the political class has got a greater conviction in going through with reforms. Would you agree with that premise?
Yes, I think let's say there are 4 or 5 things on some which I think there's complete agreement, on others sometimes we waver. Thing number 1, get rid of the idea that the public sector must occupy the commanding heights of the economy. That's gone. And I don't think anyone regrets that. 2, that growth in a modern economy is going to be led by the private sector. So you must trust your private sector and provide an environment in which they can flourish. I think that's also now broadly accepted. I mean, nobody thinks that if we want to do A and B, let's set up a public sector company to do it, okay? Now, there's a second issue that how do you make sure that the private sector doesn't overwhelm the system through cronyism? Now, here, there are really two things you have to do. One is keep the economy open so that your private sector actually competes with the best in the world in terms of low levels of protection. 1991 gave a very clear signal that Indian industry, given the right environment, can compete. And we are going to lower protection. Now there, frankly, we've had a reversal. In the last 3 or 4 years, we have seen an increase in customs duties, which is a reversal of a 30-year trend, which previous governments had steadily gone through. So I think that's an issue. Is this temporary? Would it go back to something normal or not? That's an open question. Earlier, there was a very profound suspicion of foreign direct investment. That's gone. I mean, all governments now, they welcome foreign direct investment. But you know, there is an issue that it's one thing to welcome foreign direct investment in a competitive environment. It's quite another if you're welcoming foreign direct investment behind a protected market, because that can create difficulties. So these are the issues. And I think, for example, on privatization, you know, we're now saying, and that the Congress party was never happy with privatizing a public sector unit. They were willing to sell minority stakes in public sector, but not privatize it, okay? But I think after the Congress, successive governments, including the Vajpayee government, sort of said, look, I mean, we should not hesitate. And the present government has also said it quite clearly.
Air India is
yes,
the
Air
big
India
thing.
is the first major enterprise that has got privatized. There are others that are supposed to happen. I think progress on that is a bit slow. But let's take it that I think privatization will happen. And let's hope that it does.
So how would you, I want to turn the question in another way. 1991 was a defining moment. It was a Big Bang reform, after which we have only seen incrementalism. Do you think today, 2022, there is space, political space, for a Big Bang reform of the sort that we saw in 1991?
Well, I've never been a great admirer of the Big Bang aspect, but serious reform in the sense that, let's be very clear, we don't have a system that's at the moment ideal. So we should be very clear what are the areas where we are going to have to make changes. I mean, for example, I would say in the financial sector, we are probably the only country in the world which has 70% of its banking system in the public sector. Now, if you combine that with the proposition that in the public sector, it is impossible to give managers the degree of flexibility and trust that you need for them to handle risky decisions, the answer is very clear that we have to move out of this public sector domination, and we have not been doing that. I think we should. Now, would you call that Big Bang reform? I think it's a very important reform, but we should extend the logic of what we've done elsewhere to the banking system.
So, is it more difficult to do reforms today in 2021 given the political atmosphere? Or was it easier, was it more difficult then to change the paradigm in 1991?
I don't actually think it's more difficult, but we do need to involve the public. They need to be aware of the challenges that the country faces, and we need a much franker discussion of what the issues are. I think we do face very new sets of challenges. One of the big differences between then and now. In 1991, there was a global consensus on what constitutes good policy. So in a way, we were just joining the world. That consensus has frayed today. The geopolitics is different, fragmentation at the geopolitical level, rise of China, and the rise of digital technology.
And even domestic politics has also changed.
Yes, so I think we need to think hard that in the light of the way the world is changing, how is India going to carve out a space for itself? The answers are not obvious. So unless this is discussed in the sense that people say, well, look, these are the alternatives. We could go this way, we could go that way, and let's discuss that. So in that sense, the problem is more complicated. But if we don't reform, we'll see a crisis, that's all. I mean, I don't think that India has no guarantee of doing well if it doesn't change.
Thank you.